What's up, everybody? I'm George Kors, and today let's talk about this gigantic, famous, old, dusty tome, War and Peace. I actually really love this novel. It's huge. I think it's famous for how long it is, but I really think it is worth your time. And this edition that I have here is about 1,273 pages long with notes. Has endnotes in the end, and four books and an epilogue. It's what's going on in here. This novel is hugely polyphonic. When we talk about a polyphonic novel, a novel that has many voices in it, to the extreme end is War and Peace, most likely, and definitely the hallmark of Russian polyphony. In that 19th century, when we have a ton of Russian writers, just including so many different voices inside of their works. War and Peace definitely stands out as one of those that includes so many different characters. Not only do we have a huge list of primary characters, we also have a huge list of secondary characters, and then we also have additional characters that sort of just pop in occasionally. And Tolstoy, in his work here, is including with almost scrupulous intent, I would say, a huge cast of characters in this work that is set in the early 19th century, primarily in Russia. This edition that I have is translated by Pavir and Volokonsky. I really enjoy this translation. I think that their style is really good for a work like War and Peace because of the way that they gloss items in the French or the German in here, and because of the endnotes that they provide. I think both of those really suit a good reading, in my opinion of this, because there is a fair bit of French and German in here that is untranslated in the text. You may have erroneously heard that like 50% of War and Peace is in French. That's not true. It's like less than 2%, I believe. But the translators do provide glosses of most of those instances of most, if not all, of those instances of French and German. And then they provide extensive context in the end when it comes to notes. So if there's like particularly strange references or esoteric references in there, they are providing really good and granular endnotes that you can refer back to, which I like. I think that gives a little texture, a little nuance for me as a reader, as to what's going on here. So I like this edition. There's a ton of other translations out there, and this is a discussion that will continue forever, as to which translation is best of a particular work. And I think that debate is very intense with the Russians, and let me know in the comments what your favorite translation of this novel is. I think opinions do vary. I've read a lot of Pavir and Volokonsky. I've read some other Russian translators as well who have done a fantastic job, all the while. So, this edition, it's the only thing that I have to say about this edition when I'm being completely honest, and you can see how many notes I took. And I took a lot of notes because of how long it is. It is pretty bulky, and it is pretty difficult to hold on to. So you can tell, just by how much is going on here. It's a heavy book. So that might be an issue for some folks. Maybe this is a title that we're referring to on an e-reader that might possibly make it easier for you to carry it around. When I was reading this, riding the train and stuff like that, just having to cart around this gigantic tome was a lot. So maybe something to consider with that. But I will say this, for being one of the longer novels, probably I would guess the longest novel I've read. I don't know. I can't think of another novel, but possibly Infinite Jest, but I'm not sure. It is paced nicely, and there is a good bit of action in here. And I think in terms of if you're a plot heavy reader, you're one of those folks out there who really likes to see, characters grow, develop, and change. Even though that polyphony is there, we do have three characters who I think remain a pretty significant focus throughout. And I'm not going to spoil any of what happens to them, but those are Pierre Bezukhov, Prince Nikolai Bolkonsky, and Natasha Rostova, Natasha Rostov. Those three are kind of in the center of our gravity here throughout the reading. And they're touched on in all four books and the epilogue. So if you're a little intimidated by this idea of the polyphony, of the multiplicity of, or the multitude rather, of voices that is present in this novel, just know you can focus on those three, and they will periodically pop up throughout the entirety of the text. So it is not as though like you're just getting random characters popping up here. It's not experimental in that way. Although I do think, for my experimental readers, you will like what is going on in a narrative sense, especially when it comes to this novel as a historical novel. I think my experimental readers will like it. But if you're plot focused and you're character focused, those three, Bezukhov, Bolkonsky, and Natasha Rostova, I think those three can be your focus, and that can allow you to sort of go through, the novel and appreciate those three character arcs in amongst all of these other characters. Now, I will say I love polyphonic writing. As a writer myself, that's a big thing that I do. That's a big part of my style, and I do have to, give kudos to Tolstoy here in just how fluid and nicely you move between the different characters. I think it takes a lot of talent to sort of build those transitions in there and build those connecting elements that lead us from sometimes, a commoner, a soldier, in the midst of battle, to Napoleon himself. And I think that is really, really well done. And I will say, the novel is very clearly researched. And I know that we may find more authoritative research about Napoleon and the War of 1812 and the invasion of Russia. And that is certainly goes without saying. But, I think I'd also give Tolstoy kudos just for, as a writer, committing to research in a really significant manner, which I think was executed quite well. And while we may have more authoritative texts on the historical situation of what's happening here, Austerlitz, the invasion of Russia, and so on, at the same time, it remains quite the historical document. And I think that is one of the major reasons what drew me to a reading of War and Peace is, outside of I love that polyphony, I was really excited to view this as a historical document, because a lot of the philosophization that happens in this novel is about history, and who writes history, how we write history, what is authoritative. I think that is a huge sort of thematic through line in here that is really, really exciting. And I think it's something that still we talk a lot about, and it is important for us to talk a lot about, sort of almost from a knowledge or epistemological standpoint of like, how do we know that a historian is writing in good faith? How do we know that a historian is writing in a manner that we deem is well researched, for example, or is reflective of the times? And I think that Tolstoy really dives deep into that sort of discussion, I would say. Overall, so just to give you a lay of the land here of what's going on here with the four books in the epilogue, the first book is set in 1805, and we get sort of a setting of the scene. We also get... sorry, my cat is saying hello. 1 second. Ferd needed to come on and say hello. We get a deeper dive into the Russian aristocracy in the Russian court. So this sort of book one is getting us into the social standards and the social mores that are happening in the Russian aristocracy at this time. The other thing that we get in this book is a view of like Napoleon and the Battle of Austerlitz and the current war that Europe is engaged in at that time. Um, this introduces most of our main characters. It also introduces us to the polyphony. We see a huge range of both fictitious and historical characters introduced during this book. And it really is just a way to introduce the style and the historical situation that's going on here, particularly with Napoleon. Now, if you're interested in Napoleon or Napoleonic history, I really do think that War and Peace is probably an invaluable historical document when it comes to that era. And while I said earlier, yeah, of course there are more authoritative historical texts out there about this period. I do think, when it comes to all novels are historical documents of the particular time that they're written in. And I think that this one is really evocative in that sense, and it's really unique. So historical fiction, and particularly War and Peace, I think is really worthwhile if you're interested in that time. And what was interesting to me and struck me, right off the bat, was how action-packed the novel can be. For example, I think the battle scenes can be particularly brutal. I don't find Tolstoy quite as nihilistically brutal as Dostoevsky, for example. But I do, I do think that he does portray violence, and has absolutely no choice but to in this novel to a large extent. In part, book one, introduces us to a lot of that styling. Books 2, 3, and 4 then take us on to that main course of the action, which is that build up to the invasion of Russia in 1812, and Book 2, particularly for me, was really interesting in terms of its contrast in nihilism and enlightenment. And this is where Prince Andrei and Bezukov really become major philosophical characters in the text, and they're a great contrast. One of the other things in Book 2 that I think is you can really look forward to is the scenes regarding the Great Comet. And this is like setting the scene for the greater invasion of Russia in that sort of descent into the madness of war and the chaos of war, which we see played out significantly in books 3 and 4. The war with Napoleon in 1812 and these sort of invasion of Moscow. It is a huge part of this novel. And one thing that I really appreciate about books 3 and 4 is the use of historical characters. The use of Napoleon himself as a character, as well as several other historical figures that figure into this conflict, I thought was really, really provocative. And the use of Napoleon as a character is really interesting in the sense of, how Tolstoy is talking about, Mother Russia, and having Napoleon be this really polarizing character, this symbol of Western European Enlightenment, while also being almost this sort of antichrist symbol, is really, really interestingly done. And having Napoleon as a character in the novel is really important for that. And then our epilogue is split into two parts. We have a narrative section, and then we have a philosophical section right at the end, which is a critique of how history is written, who writes it, and what the best methods are. And that is something, this sort of philosophizing happens throughout the text. It is present in the entirety of the novel. And I think that is really important to sort of highlight here, is to sort of prepare yourself for those moments when Tolstoy wants to explore more deeply what it is to be a historian, what it is to be a history text, what it is to write a history text. A lot of this goes above and beyond what we might expect from a Russian novel of this era, where we're thinking a lot about enlightenment and God and nihilism and the interplay of these varying philosophies and factors in 19th century Russia. Now, one thing I will highlight about this novel that I thought was really interesting is that Tolstoy did intend at its onset to have this be a novel about the Decembrists and the Decembrist uprising. And to me, I find that really, really interesting because we don't get a lot of, or any material about the Decembrist uprising in this novel. And that's not a spoiler at all, because it's just not the focus. But what we do see is this rich tapestry created that is sort of setting the scene for what eventually would become the Decembrist uprising and the political machinations and discontent that are in all of that. And I think that that is really important here. And I think that, to me, that is one of the really most provocative things I can think of when it comes to his criticism of what it means to be a historian and what it means to write history. Are we to take a novel with fictitious characters in it as an authoritative history? How are we to use that? How are we to refer to that? I think these sorts of philosophical questions abound throughout the novel, and I think they're really important to our reading of the novel because it forces us as the reader to sort of take a serious step back and say, wait a minute, what are we even doing here? This novel is 1,300 pages long. What are we supposed to make of this? Am I supposed to be well informed about this era, 1805 to maybe, let's say, 1820-ish in Russia? Or is there something lacking in my telling, or reading rather, and is there something lacking in Tolstoy's telling? I think that is a major thing for us to consider throughout the text. And I think that it has most immediate implications on the use of historical figures and events in the novel in comparison to the use of fictitious characters. I think that Tolstoy is very famous for having conducted a ton of research for this work. So it is something that we need to sort of consider as like, what is a historical telling in this novel versus what is a narrative telling? Because in this novel, we don't just have, these, historical accounts of battles. There is so much intrigue in the Russian court, intrigue between families. There are love stories. There are, friendships portrayed, Christmas parties. There's a huge section where they go on a hunt that's really beautifully written. And what's more is there's a ton of nature writing in here. And there's a lot of depictions of beautiful pastoral scenes and a wide variety of instances where we are in a very distinct fictional setting, and that is very, very evident. And then we have those contrasted, of course, with our situations where we might have, discussions between particular generals. We might have battle portrayed, and so on and so forth. And there is just a ton of material there. And that is something that the novelist gets to do in a work that is as long as War and Peace. And I think that is important to consider here, is that we do have an unusually long novel. And when we're thinking about the novel as a piece of art, I do think there is something to be said for how a novel is very unique in the kind of depth that one can achieve with it. I don't think outside of, I'm not sure that I would consider a lot of other art forms as able to reach the kind of granularity that you can reach with a novel. And I think a work like War and Peace really demonstrates that. For me as a novelist, when I think about how significantly detailed a work of fiction can be on the page, I do think that War and Peace is a really good example of just how significantly layered a work can be. It does, I think the only way to summarize a novel like War and Peace is to do so really reductively and overshadow a lot of what is going on in here. So, to that extent, I think as readers, we do need to be open to this idea of just engaging with an absolutely huge work. Um, and I mean that in the sense of understanding that there are going to be so many different themes, so many different characters, so many different ideas posited throughout the work that you can really attach onto and focus on any sort of wide variety of themes there. And I have a few themes that I would highlight that I think are really cool in the work that for me were really exciting. Um, the first one is I mentioned this a little bit earlier is hard determinism versus God versus enlightenment versus nihilism. So, and I would say free will is part of this as well. And this is a discussion that happens time and again with pretty much in every single book of the novel, happens with a huge range of characters, which is to what extent does an individual have free will? To what extent is a person's fate determined by God? And this is what we call hard determinism or deterministic thinking. Um, Hard determinism being the philosophy where God determines everything. You do not have any free will. Everything is predetermined for you, predestined for you. How God factors into this, what godliness is. And the Russian God is a huge, huge theme throughout all of this. And then we have themes of enlightenment. What is enlightenment? How does one be enlightened? Is enlightenment good? Does enlightenment threaten your relationship with God? Does it threaten your relationship with the Russian church? And then, of course, we've got discussions of ultimately nihilism. Is nihilism the path of enlightenment? Is it is nihilism the path of rejecting your duty? Um, are we all just here to be annihilated in a war with Napoleon? These questions and many more, they are all intersecting in various ways in the novel, and it is really cool. And that might not sound cool to you, but it is really fundamentally human. These questions of why am I here? What am I doing? What is my choice? What is not my choice? These are really fundamental, I think, to us as people. And I think Tolstoy does a really fantastic job in the novel of giving each character, even characters that appear briefly, or even Napoleon himself, giving those characters the humanity to ask these questions. To question their faith, to be in a place where they're questioning their own enlightenment, for example. And I think Bezukov and Bolkonsky and Natasha being those three characters that you can focus on who might be considered our main characters here. I think focusing in on those three, you're going to get so many different, wandering philosophies where they're going to be thinking about, life and who they are in a variety of really complex ways. And one of my favorite ways that happens, which is one of the things I loved about this, is sometimes these discussions get inspired by nature. You'll see Prince Andre, looking at the leaves in spring or looking at a tree. He looks at a tree in winter, and then he looks at the same tree in spring and wonders about the cycle of life. This is just really poetic. It's really beautiful. And throughout the text, in addition to the sort of philosophizing that we have about history, about free will and enlightenment and theology, we also have beautiful nature writing. At one point, I wrote down in the front here is that there are so many stars in the Russian sky because there are so many scenes here that are just absolutely wrought with wonderful nature writing, depictions of pastoral scenes that really stick with me. And that is something that for me, I love. As a writer, I want to see the natural world portrayed in a very, very intimate way because it is so near and dear to us. It's who we are on this planet. And there's one American author that does it so fantastically. That's Willa Cather. I love Willa Cather for her nature writing. And I think Tolstoy is right there. I think Tolstoy was doing a wonderful job, particularly in the contrast of nature when you're in that peacetime versus when you're at war. and just seeing the scenes portrayed and how nature affects our characters. My favorite line in the novel might be "drips drop," which is, there's the scene where it's raining and they're right about to go into battle, and it's just one of the heaviest scenes in the novel. And that phrase "drips drop," it's so evocative of the sound that nature has surrounding these individuals in that particular scene. I think it's really well done. And I think that leads me to another theme that I think might be obvious for some folks, but I think I would just reiterate it, which is the line between violence and peace, between war and peace, pardon the pun. I think that sort of philosophical line is a big part of what's going on in the novel, and it's something that we need to pay attention to, because for as much violence and chronicling of war as we have here, so too do we have as much, possibly more, chronicling of peace and families at the home, or celebrating a birthday or Christmas, or attending a ball, or attending or attending the opera together. And I think that is really really fantastic, really really excellently done. I think, in terms of how that line between, what spurs violence and what spurs peace, that leads me to another theme that I think is more subtle but really important. I don't know that it's necessarily the most subtle theme of the novel, but I think that it's really, really important. And that is indifference versus duty. What a person owes themselves versus owes their family versus owes their nation versus owes their religion. These are considerations, again, much like our sort of theological and philosophical considerations of enlightenment versus, religion and determinism and free will and nihilism. Much like those, this is another sort of philosophical question that the characters are asking themselves time and time again. What duties do I have, and how do I ethically and morally carry out those duties? This is, I think this is also, for me, this indifference versus duty viewpoint. I think for me, this is one of the most timely aspects of the novel. And I say that because I think, on a philosophical level, when we think about our own society that we live in right now, as readers of War and Peace gathering here on YouTube, for example, to look through this novel as a historical document, we have our own roles in our own societies, and we also have to navigate, what is moral, what is immoral, what is ethical, what is unethical in that society that you and me inhabit right now. And that question of indifference versus duty, I think, is really, really important right now, because I do think that indifference is one of those things that creeps into a society, and really has a lot more of a dramatic effect than most individuals anticipate. And I think right now, this discussion of indifference and duty and how it is here in War and Peace, I mean, to me, I think that is something that we could really, really think about. And, for example, I was taking notes. I just took notes on all the instances I found about indifference, and I found many of them. And many, many situations where a character is, debating, am I able to just not care about this? Am I able to not fulfill whatever abstract duty has been created for me? This is important stuff. And I think that is really provocative for me. As a thinker, I was really excited about that, because I think, Tolstoy, when it comes to, in that discussion between Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, when I'm looking for discussions of nihilism and discussions of, is the soul just meant to be annihilated by a violent experience on Earth? I think I'm looking to Dostoevsky over Tolstoy. For me, that is, the way Dostoevsky is thinking through on the page a lot of that sort of philosophical content regarding annihilation. I think that, for me, resonates more than with Tolstoy. With Tolstoy, on the other hand, I am thinking and deferring to Tolstoy a lot more about what it means to have an obligation or a duty and what it means to carry out that obligation. In our society, this is really complicated. And obviously, we may, as individuals in our present time, we may not be so familiar with or even really supportive of the way that Russian society and aristocracy was carrying itself out as a society at that time when this novel is set. But we can look to them as an example and as a historical document that might be enlightening for us in how we carry out our own sense of obligation and morals and duty. And that is some of the really most complicated thematic stuff for me throughout this is, looking at, character after character in wartime or in peacetime, how they are approaching the decisions that they're making as I need to do this because it's right, or I should not do it because it's wrong, or I don't care. Um, and that I don't care thread, that third one there, is very chaotic, and there's some characters in here who really embrace it, and you see that throughout the novel. I think that leads me to another theme here, which I think is important, which is this theme that is overarching, which is religion versus nation. And for my folks out there who have read Benedict Anderson, I've recommended Benedict Anderson a few times. Let me pull him off the shelf here. If you have read Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, you know that in that 19th century period, spurred in large part by the Napoleonic era, we see a transition in European societies from focusing on religion as a primary method of identity to focusing on nation. So, going from, oh, I'm a Catholic to, oh, I'm a French Catholic. Going from, oh, I'm an Orthodox Catholic to, oh, I'm a Russian Orthodox Catholic. This is something that's major in Benedict Anderson's work here, Imagined Communities. And this is another philosophical through line that we see here time and time again. And we see it particularly with those historical characters, as we see them, especially, I think book one is really provocative because in book one, when we're talking about like setting the scene and, Napoleon's current war in Europe, we see these individuals talking about nation and nationhood and talking about Napoleon forging this nation in France. And then when we have, several years later, when we have the bulk of the action of the novel in books 2, 3, and 4, I think there, especially our Russian characters, are contending with this duality of religion versus nation, and to what extent a person belongs to either, both, or neither, and which is more important. I think that in terms of the moral philosophical side of the novel, this evolution of enlightenment in Europe at that time, and how that enlightenment leads to folks identifying more as part of a nation as opposed to a part of a religion. I think that is something that is really important to the novel, and I think that is, if you were to go through a reading of War and Peace and just look at how somebody relates to their nation versus how somebody relates to their religion, and how that is sort of a fluid aspect of identity at that time, I think that's really big. Because I think for a lot of our contemporary readers, the way gender roles, the way patriarchy is, existent inside of the text is of course, something that we are still rebelling against in our current society. And I think that is just a bigger part of looking at this historical era and trying to take things out of it, is understanding and giving that era a little bit more complexity as just, oh, it was worse then. Of course, we're talking about a Russian society here that is thriving off serfdom. We're talking about a European society that is, pillaging the world in the colonial project. It is, of course, without saying, terrible, terrible times. However, thinking through those more human philosophies of like our duty, who do we owe ourselves to, and I think religion versus nation. If you're in the United States, I mean, there's no bigger questions for some individuals in our country than religion versus nation and how those two things interact. We're still seeing these philosophical discussions played out every day throughout this country. There's no question about it. And to that end, I do think a reading of War and Peace is timely. I think it's something that has a lot of relevance to us, because I think these eras of great societal upheaval, no matter what those societies looked like at that time, they provide us with really rich lessons that we can carry out in our own lives. It doesn't pay to live in interesting times. We live in interesting times. I mean, look all around you. It is complicated here in the United States, and I know it's definitely complicated over in Europe as well. And I think War and Peace can afford us some of those moments to sort of reflect more seriously on who we are and what we're doing, because we definitely see the characters doing that throughout this work. And I think Tolstoy as an individual is really provocative for me. When Tolstoy was writing this, Tolstoy's of the aristocracy, but Tolstoy later in life becomes a Christian anarchist and wants to give up the copyright to War and Peace and Anna Karenina. And thinking about how Tolstoy as an individual is going through these philosophical discussions on his own and is reaching a conclusion like anarchism is something for us to think about as well and to take really seriously. I started off this video by saying, yeah, there's a lot of plot here, and there is, but I also think that there's so much thinking that we can do in this novel. I think you can almost take two different paths here, where you could read War and Peace just for the narrative and just have a good time of it, and not pay as much mind to those sections that are more philosophical, or you could go down the rabbit hole and start thinking about, the philosophies and that longer tradition that we still belong to as individuals who have inherited the earth from the previous generations before us. Something to think about there. Some things that I loved about the novel, I mentioned this already, but stars, rivers, and trees. Any of the nature writing, especially at night or when it's raining, and just how trees and rivers go from frozen in the winter to beautiful and lined with wildflowers in the spring is so evocative. And I think it's so almost, it harkens back to this desire to be a more mindful part of nature that I thought was really, really interesting throughout the novel. Another thing is love. There's major love stories going on throughout the work, and I think that's something that our narrative readers you folks can attach to pretty significantly here. But also, one of the things that I find hilarious, and I really enjoyed it, was how people perceive themselves as an individual who is loved. And there's more than one instance of something bad happening to a character, and that character being like, wait a minute, everybody loves me. Why is something bad happening to me? And this sort of, deep dive into, how we might selfishly feel about ourselves as an individual who's loved, I thought was really, really interesting. And then, another thing that I really enjoyed was the use of historical characters. I really thought that was really well done, and I thought it was so interesting, to see time and time again Napoleon come up as a character in here, and various other famous generals, but Napoleon particularly, I thought was really, really excellent. Overall, I think War and Peace, maybe it's so long that you break it up into a couple of readings, read one book at a time or something. But I really do think it merits a contemporary reading, and I also think that it's really timely. I think, like I said, these novels that approach times of significant upheaval, the invasion of Russia and the burning of Moscow is a huge historical event in Russia. That can provide for us a lot of significant thinking to go through as readers and individuals as we're dealing with with this novel. So I think that is for sure a major thing that I would recommend here, is just to, let yourself be taken away by this novel. Let yourself enjoy it. And if you're interested, if you are, I mentioned a little bit back, if you're interested in experimental novels, I don't think you're going to see a lot in terms of necessarily the form, how things are laid out on the page here, but just how Tolstoy moves between the philosophical and the narrative aspects of the piece. I think is really well done, and I think that's something that if you're sort of trained to that sort of experimental reading, I think it merits a read to see how he bounces back and forth between those two particular aspects of the novel. Let's talk a little bit about some of my reading recommendations here, and I have quite a few of them. So let's get into them. I'm going to talk about one first, which is a rewrite of it's a rewrite of the novel that came out much later, and that is Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. And Life and Fate, this is definitely a rewrite of War and Peace. It is set in the final days of Stalingrad, as the Russians are beginning to expel the invading German force. It has significant parallels. It is likewise huge. I mean, it's 800, 900 pages almost. This, I think, is one of the most important works to come out of the Second World War, without a doubt. It is the most brutal novel I have ever read in terms of some of the scenes here. And I would say this, this novel probably has a significant effect on each and every one of its readers. This is also a deeply philosophical novel, and it also is, reflecting significantly on duty. But Life and Fate is looking significantly at totalitarianism, and is looking at society from a different lens. And I do think if you have read War and Peace and you're looking for something a little bit more contemporary, Life and Fate should be it. But reader be warned, some of the scenes in here show the depths of humanity far worse than a novel like Blood Meridian might, for example. So heads up on that. But definitely Vasily Grossman. Wow, what a great novel. And Robert Chandler's translation here is really, really excellent. Another work that I'm going to recommend, another European work that is set over many years, but I think is a historical novel, kind of accomplishes some similar thinking philosophically, is Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann. And this is about a family in Lübeck, in the northern German city of Lübeck, a prosperous merchant family, and their downfall. And I think the way that historical events are written in this novel is really provocative. And I do think this, if you liked the historical novel aspect of War and Peace, I think Buddenbrooks might be of interest to you. This is in the original German. I think John Woods probably has a good translation of that. If you enjoyed the depiction of war in War and Peace, and that was sort of the historical novel aspect that you enjoyed the most, I think I'd recommend Uncertain Glory by Joan. This is translated from the Catalan by Peter Bush. I really loved this particular translation, and I just thought it was really, really an excellent novel set in the Spanish Civil War. So another novel about great upheaval that I think might be really relevant to folks and you might really enjoy. And then my last recommendation for today is a novel that's really near and dear to my heart, because it definitely affected a lot of my writing for Always the Wanderer and a lot of my thinking as a post-colonial scholar, which is by Abdelrahman Munif, Cities of Salt. This is a really overlooked novel, and in my opinion, I think this should probably be much more widely read than it is. Cities of Salt is translated from the Arabic. This is translated from the Arabic. Let's see, who translated this from the Arabic? It's translated from the Arabic, and it's set in sort of an unnamed unnamed Persian Gulf state, which is a fictionalized Saudi Arabia, translated from the Arabic by Peter Thoreau. And it chronicles Arab and Bedouin reactions to the establishment of oil companies by Americans in the 1930s. And the historical precedent here is the establishment of Aramco in Saudi Arabia by Americans. And the Arab and Bedouin reactions to the incursions of this sort of capitalist imperialism is significant. This is something, if you're an American, you probably should be reading this, because this is a big part of our history that goes unexplored in that relationship that we have over there with Saudi Arabia. And Cities of Salt does a really fantastic job. And I think Munif, definitely has a lot to say here. And I think that thread in War and Peace of Moscow being invaded, I think if that was something that is really interesting to you, I think Cities of Salt and just seeing how folks react to a different kind of passive invasion is really important. And Cities of Salt is a really great novel, really important to me, what Munif did. Overall, I think War and Peace, when it comes down to it, this might be one of those novels that folks are kind of hesitant to read because of its length. I just want to encourage you, go for it. Give it a shot. I think, the text and the prose of a lot of these Russian translations can be very verbose, and that can take getting used to. I think the other thing that can take getting used to is Russian naming conventions and the sheer amount of characters that we have. That's okay. You're going to get through it. You can definitely learn that. Like, don't shortchange yourself. Give it a shot here, because I think that this might be a novel that a lot of folks really end up loving. And I do think 1,300 pages. It's an accomplishment. It's well worth the challenge to delve into this novel. If only just to learn about the historical period, but also, to see, some really complicated love stories and see some beautiful depictions of nature and, see, it's not all the time that you see historical characters included in novels. It's much more common now than when Tolstoy was writing. But it's not all the time that we see historical characters done in a way that's not satirical or farcical. This isn't like Thomas Pynchon stuff here. This is real serious history. And, like I said, obviously there's more authoritative readings of it, but we don't see, that serious emotional side of historical characters or historical figures so frequently. And the other book that does it big time is Life and Fate. There's a scene in Life and Fate where Hitler just goes on a walk alone, and it's a really harrowing scene. And you get those scenes with Napoleon here big time. I think that is something for us to think about, and it's really controversial to do that too. I want to say that it is really controversial to humanize these grand historical figures. Grand, it can be in the evil negative sense or positive sense. It is very controversial to do that. So I would say, that is something to consider here as well if you're one of those historical fiction readers. Definitely Tolstoy is doing this in a really complicated way. And I think the way that Vasily Grossman approaches it, just a little context on Vasily Grossman. Vasily Grossman is a Soviet journalist who grew up in the Ukraine, and as a Jew, most of his family was liquidated in the Holocaust. And he is writing after the fact. This manuscript was finished in the 1960s. So going after that sort of material here, Grossman is astounding. If you can't tell, Life and Fate is one of the biggest novels out there, in my opinion. And it is a worthy rewrite of War and Peace. I think reading the two of them together, if you were really interested in delving into two really long, really intense books back to back, that might be quite a challenge for you. But let me know. I want to know what you think about War and Peace. Have you read it? Are you going to read it? Have I convinced you? I hope I have, to give it a shot. And just, let me know in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are, because I really do think this novel surprised me in how fresh it felt. The translation probably did a lot of that, but I really did feel like it was timely. And let me know in the comments. What do you think? Are you gonna read the book? Have you read it? What are your thoughts about it? As always, I want to thank you folks so much for being with me today, hanging out with me and talking about War and Peace. I know. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. And as always, if you want, please read my novel. Read Always the Wanderer. If you've read Cities of Salt out there, Always the Wanderer definitely takes major influence from Cities of Salt. And you have my eternal gratitude for that. You can find out more about me as a novelist and as a person and a thinker at my website, georgekors.com, or you can follow me on some socials at gbk7288. Please like and subscribe, and thank you again so much for spending some time with me today. I hope you have a safe and wonderful day, and thank you again, and read War and Peace. Why not? I mean, just take on a giant book. So thank you so much, folks, and have a great day. Adios.